Howdy folks, and welcome back to Bridgetown Abridged. This year we will have a huge number of ballot measures to vote on in November, and none of them will affect Portland's government more than Measure 26228, which aims to make fundamental changes to our city's government by amending the city charter. So let's get right into it. First off, let's discuss exactly what a city charter is. A city charter is like a city's constitution. It dictates how a city must operate and function. Part of the Portland City Charter dictates that the City Council must appoint a 20-person commission at least once every 10 years to review and suggest changes to the city charter. If enough of the commission agrees to changes to the charter, then those changes go directly to our ballots in the form of a measure, and Measure 26228 is just such a measure. The commission agreed that they believed that these changes would be good for our city government, and so they sent them to us to vote on. So the text of Measure 26228's summary reads, amends charter, county officials elected using ranked choice voting, runoff elections eliminated. So like most complex measures, that summary is pretty unhelpful. Let's break it down a little bit more and get into the details. The measure really does three different things. First, it replaces our commission form of city government with a 12-person city council, with a city administrator to work with the mayor to oversee day-to-day operations. Secondly, it creates 4 geographic council districts that will each elect 3 of the new city councilors. And lastly, it implements ranked choice voting in our citywide elections. Now that's a lot of changes packed into one little ballot measure. It's essentially a complete overhaul of the top levels of our city government. And while no one's quite throwing tea into the Willamette, the polling on the issue shows that Portlanders are pretty ready for a change to their city government. So let's get a little further into the details and answer some likely questions we all might have. The first change is to change from a commission form of government to a city council form. Right now we have a mayor and 4 city commissioners who are elected at large, which just means that the whole city votes for them. The mayor and each commissioner is responsible for overseeing particular city departments, and they vote as a group, including the mayor, on city legislation. In our system, the mayor is what's considered a weak mayor because he doesn't really have much more executive power than a normal commissioner does. So no matter what you think of Ted Wheeler, it can definitionally be said that he's pretty weak. Now, it should be said we are the only large city in the US with a system like this. It used to be the most popular form of municipal government, but every other city that had it has abandoned it because of the issues that are inherent in its design. Namely, there's a lot of gridlock because we essentially have 5 mini-mayors who are all trying to create laws while also enforcing those laws, and they also are competing for resources for each of their separate departments at the exact same time. So that's what we have. Let's move on to what we're moving towards. We're likely going to be moving towards a type of municipal government known as a mayor-council. As you can see, this is the second most common form of city government, and it's quite common amongst major metropolitan areas. One reason for this is because it's significantly more functional than a commission is. If passed, the city council would continue to exercise legislative power to make laws and approve the city's budget. The mayor would no longer really be a member of the city council, but could introduce laws and break tie votes on non-emergency ordinances. The mayor would also no longer have veto power, but the mayor would have a vote in matters before the city council only to break a council tie, so the mayor would no longer serve or regularly vote on the city council anymore. The city administrator would be responsible for implementing the laws approved by the city council and managing the city bureaus. The city administrator would hire, fire, and supervise the bureau directors, except for the police chief and the city attorney, both of whom would be hired directly by the mayor after approval by the city council. The city administrator would be hired by the mayor and confirmed by the city council, but the mayor would manage the city administrator, who could be fired either by the mayor or a vote of 3/4 of the city council. By this point, you might be saying, Bridgetown, these mostly sound like changes from the mayor, but you've talked a lot about these city councilors. How are they different from our city commissioners today? And I would say, what a conveniently timed question for my script audience member. Let's go over what we've covered for the councilor changes so far. These new councilors are not bureau heads the way that they are today. It's argued that this would be beneficial since they would now be interested in voting what's the best case for the city rather than what's the best outcome for their own bureau. And we also know they can't be vetoed by the mayor, but the mayor can break ties. So those are some big changes, but they're about to get even bigger. The first is that we're going to be going from 4 commissioners to 12 councilors. The number of councilors on a city council is generally correlated to the size of a city, so proportionally we actually have a very small city council currently. Our peer cities such as Denver and Boston, which both have a similar population to Portland, both already have 13 council members, for example. The second change is that each of these councilors would represent 4 geographic districts. 3 councilors would represent each district, while the mayor and the auditor would still be elected at large by the whole city. The argument here is that geographic districts would provide voters of each district the opportunity to elect a candidate from their own community and then hold those elected leaders accountable. It should also be said that having at-large elections is pretty uncommon for large cities. As a city grows, needs can tend to differ by each district and who is not in a district. Speaking of which, an obvious question is, who will be creating the districts? And the answer is actually me. We're going to need to make Forest Park its own district because who else will speak for the trees? In actuality, an independent districting commission would bear the responsibility of preparing and adopting a plan to create these 4 separate districts, along with involvement from the public. The first commission would be appointed by the mayor and confirmed by the city commission in next January 2023. Their purpose would be to create equally populated districts that are one connected piece, trying to use existing geographic and political boundaries and not dividing communities. As much as that's all feasible, because obviously that's a pretty big ask. We would then recreate these districts every 10 years after the census comes out. So that carries us right to our last change, which would be to implement ranked choice voting. Now, ranked choice voting is a topic with a lot of ins and outs, so I'll link to some good videos in the doobly-doo for further comprehension. The long and short of it is that our city, much like most US elections, currently uses a voting system that's referred to as first past the post. Whoever gets the most votes wins, essentially. Ranked choice voting is an objectively more democratic system that aims at electing officials that more voters actually approve of. Instead of picking one candidate, you rank every candidate by how much you approve of them, and then the voter with the most overall approval wins the election. This ballot measure would change the mayor and the city auditor elections to use a simple form of ranked choice voting referred to as instant runoff. Essentially, we rank all of the candidates from our most approved to our least approved. When the votes are counted, if no candidate reaches 50% of the vote, then the candidate with the least votes is eliminated, and anyone who ranked them the highest has their vote moved to their second choice. This process then continues until one candidate has reached 50% of the vote and wins. It's essentially like if we had an election, we eliminated the person with the least votes, and then instantly held a runoff election afterwards, which is how it gets its name of instant runoff. Now, for the city councilors, we would be using what's referred to as a single transferable vote method. Candidates would win when they exceed a threshold set by the number of available positions. The ballots would be counted in rounds, and then any candidate exceeding the threshold would be elected, and that candidate's votes would then be proportionally transferred to other candidates based on their voting preferences. Candidates also receiving the fewest votes would be eliminated, and those votes would be transferred to the other candidates based on their preferences. It's kind of like instant runoff if we would eliminate the top and the bottom to move the votes into the middle. This form of ranked choice voting involves a lot more math, but the long and short of it is basically that it's set up to make sure that the 3 people in each district who have the most approval of the voters end up getting elected. That way, if one person gets an overwhelming amount of the votes, the people who voted for them still get to have their say in who the second and third candidates are, thus preventing a problem where we have a second and a third candidate that nobody really liked that much. So, those are the 3 main changes that would be made by this ballot measure. Replacing our city commission with a city council made up of 12 people, creating 4 geographic council districts that elect 3 city councilors each, and implementing 2 forms of ranked choice voting in our citywide elections. Now that we've talked about what the measure does, let's talk about some arguments both for and against it. So some of the main arguments in favor of this are specifically about the ranked choice voting implementation. It should be said that ranked choice voting is an objective and proven way to hold more democratic elections. It also increases voter turnout and it increases people's confidence in our elections. Ranked choice voting is also a lot more easy than people think it is. 85% of Alaskans who used ranked choice voting in their last election have said that it was very easy to use, and they just implemented it recently. This system also eliminates our current primary process, which would simplify our city elections to just be one singular election. Also, as I stated before, our city council is currently pretty small proportionally for the size of Portland, so this would kind of bring us up to the norm. As I also said before, splitting the at-large elections into geographic regional elections would also increase voter turnout and confidence in the election, as the elected officials would more directly represent the people who are there supporting. So now this is a list of everybody who is in favor of this ballot measure, which you can see is a very, very long and comprehensive list of a variety of different organizations across Oregon. Moving on to the arguments against, they're pretty few. One of them is that Portland would be moving from one form of government that no other large city uses to another form of government that's not very common. And there's also an argument that they're worried that increasing the number of members on the city council would dilute their responsibility. And despite the fact that this system is fairly common, there is some worry that the mayor would not have much more authority and would give too much authority to the city administrator rather than the mayor. Now, for opponents of the measure, the only person or group that I could find was the Willamette Week, and I did look through both the voter guide and I scoured the internet for a bit to try to find anyone, and I couldn't find anyone but Willamette Week. So it does look like this ballot measure has quite a bit of support, and the polling seems to imply that it's going to happen, but I did really want to make a video about this, both to explain to people what we're voting on, and also in the future so that people could look back on this if they have any questions about how the new city government is going to work. Well, I think that just about wraps everything up. I want to thank everybody for coming to watch this video today, and I hope that it was useful. If you could like, share, and subscribe, that would be great. And other than that, I just hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks, everybody.